So in the second screencast on Chapter 13, Biodiversity, we're going to look at genetic diversity. We're going to look at the types of species that are threatened with extinction, and we're going to look at the levels of threat of extinction. So first we'll start with genetic diversity, which is the variety of genes within a single species. As with species diversity and ecosystem diversity, in the case of genetic diversity, the more diversity, the more likely survival will occur despite any environmental change. So specifically, the more genetic diversity within a species, the more likely that that species will survive any environmental change. So as the number of individuals of species begins to decline to a critical point, there's a very limited gene pool, so the genetic diversity of the species declines. So for example, here was a little picture of a Florida panther. As the Florida panther's habitat was taken over by humans, and how humans did not want, let's say, a Florida panther in Miami. In Miami in the 1920s, there were actually panther attacks on people, riding down the street on a bicycle, for example. So for this and other reasons, including habitat destruction, the number of panthers declined significantly to a point where they were endangered. On the fortunate side, there were panthers living in Texas that were actually the same species, but had different genes. And so people were able to introduce the Texas panther, which were actually the same species as the Florida panther, and increase their genetic diversity so that they can survive till today. So let's look at why having a limited number of individuals of a species with a limited number of genes is a problem. So when you have what's called inbreeding, when individuals with similar genes breed with each other, it leads to offspring that are more likely to have harmful mutations, and therefore they're less likely to survive. If they do survive, they're less likely to reproduce. And that's called inbreeding depression. So let's talk about the right whale for a minute. The right whale, which is threatened with extinction, the numbers were in the 400 to 420 range. And when you get below 400, generally the species is fairly doomed to extinction. And the numbers in recent years did go below 400. And in fact, not last year, but the year before, there were no offspring born to the right whales. None. And that's a significant problem. Last year, though, they did have a number of calves. I don't remember the exact number. I want to say 6 or more. And this year, they're already seeing some calves being brought to Cape Cod waters. So that's a good sign. But let's talk for a minute about why the right whale became so endangered. So there's a reason why the right whale, spelled R-I-G-H-T, is called the right whale. And it's not because it's right-handed or right-finned. It was the right whale for hunting because when the hunter was in a small boat with a harpoon and they harpooned the right whale, it floated instead of sinking. And therefore the boat and the hunters were not dragged down with it. And so it made it very easy to hunt. Also, the amount of blubber and so forth that could be removed from the organism was a large amount relative to other species. So it became the right whale to hunt. That's no longer allowed. And again, we're hoping that that species can be saved. Now we're going to continue on with the topic of genetic diversity. But instead of talking about wild animals, now we're going to look at crops and livestock. Okay, so crops The diversity in crops and livestock have also been declining. And this has occurred and is an issue over many centuries. Because if you have less diversity of crops or livestock, and a disease comes through and wipes out those crops or livestock, then your food supply chain is endangered. So you may have heard of the Irish potato famine. And during the Irish potato famine, people in Ireland who were on the more poor side relied on potatoes for the bulk of their calories. And a fungus came through, not just one season, but for several seasons. And this fungal blight wiped out the potato crops. And so the Irish people who depended on those crops were, forced to starvation. And that is why they emigrated to the United States. Now, that's not just a thing of centuries ago. Here in the United States, just a few years ago, we had a disease go through our corn crops, which also significantly wiped out a significant portion of our crops. We still did have enough corn, so there were no major catastrophes from it, but it is a good example of how that can still happen. So what do we do to preserve biodiversity in crops and livestock? Well, let's start with crops. A number of countries have built their own seed banks or seed vaults, where they take a whole genetic variety of seed plants and preserve the seeds so that if something like this does happen, a disease spreads through, they may have a type of seed that is resistant to that disease and then be able to survive. So for example, apples. There are actually maybe 1,000 varieties of apples, as little as 100 years ago. But because of our supermarket supply chain, we want everything to look nice and red and be firm enough and not get soft, etc., etc. If you go into a grocery store, you will certainly find less than 10 varieties of apples. So that's a very small number compared to 1,000 varieties of apples. So preserving those seeds becomes important. Now, on a global scale, in addition, countries have gotten together and constructed a giant global seed bank. It's located on an island off of Norway, so it's very secluded, very cold. Initially, you weren't allowed to even have any pictures of this, so we have this rendering here that I think is from your textbook. You see a little guard outside and an entry area, and then a big long section here built into the mountain so that the seeds would stay nice and cold and hopefully would hopefully last a long, long time. And nowadays, we have been able to get actual pictures of it. Here's one. And there's some pictures of the inside where you see rows of deep freezers with the metallic drawers where they can keep these seeds. But it still begs the question, if something really happens globally, it's not going to be all that easy for countries to cooperate, perhaps. Well, just think about the potential ramifications of needing to access a global seed bank as opposed to your own country's seed bank. All right, so now we're going to turn away from the topic of diversity and look at larger categories of endangerment and what general categories of species on Earth have been fit into those different categories. So here are the 4 categories of endangerment. Extinct. No individuals of that species are known to exist today. An example of that would be the dodo bird. The dodo bird was a large flightless bird, and it had no predators and especially had no exposure to humans, so it wasn't afraid of them. And so the dodo bird and its eggs were hunted. And in addition, when the sailors and settlers came to the island, they brought along with them rodents such as rats, which also ate the eggs of the dodo bird. And so the dodo bird became extinct. There are no longer any dodo birds available in the world today. The second category is threatened. That's a species or group of species with a high risk of becoming extinct in the future. So a prime example of a threatened species would be the right whale. They're at a high risk of becoming extinct in the future because they currently have only about 400 individuals of that species. And that's the North Atlantic right whale. I should be more specific there. But they're definitely threatened, and so without active interventions and protections, they would move into the category of extinct. The next category is near threatened. Those are species that are likely to become threatened in the future. So they're a little at risk, but not completely threatened. So I think I would put the example of songbirds as a general group in that category. Certainly the number of songbirds has been declining since 1970s or before, and but they haven't been completely moved into the threatened category. So that would be an example of near threatened. And last we have least concern, species that are widespread and abundant in numbers. So things like crows and some insects like roaches are certainly of no concern right now, so they would go into the category of least concern. Last for this screencast, we'll look at some categories of organisms that fall into these categories and what their risks are. So the categories that we're looking at here are birds, mammals, and amphibians. And we're going to look at the decline of each. So there are three categories here. They will be categorized as either threatened, which is red, near threatened, yellow, and least concern, which is green. So clearly you can see here the least concern are the birds at 79%, followed by mammals at 68%, and amphibians all the way down at 51%. If we look at it slightly differently, the threatened number of species among birds are 12. It increases here to 25% with mammals, so 1/4 of all mammals are threatened. That's a significant amount. And then if we move here to amphibians, you see an even higher percentage. Over 40% of amphibians are threatened. So pause for a minute and think why that might be. Do you know anything about the characteristics of these different organisms? How they move, what types of environment they live in, how they breathe, how they reproduce, and see if you can pause this video for a moment and figure out why these categories break out this way. So let's start with the birds. They fly. That can have a disadvantage in that they could be exposed to various toxins all along migratory routes and so forth. But they also have the possibility that when one area is contaminated or their habitat is destroyed, there is a possibility that they can move large distances to a better habitat for them. Okay, mammals, 25%. So one of the major concerns with mammals is the reproductive capacity. So in other words, mammals tend to have fewer offspring than birds, and they tend to have taken care of their offspring for longer periods of time. So, for example, humans are mammals. Reproductive age is not reached until 14 plus years, let's say 15 plus years. That's often true of other mammals. Mammals tend to feed their young. Well, they do feed their young with breast milk. And they tend to raise their young for longer periods of time. So they don't have a high reproductive capacity. They have some capacity to migrate if their habitat is destroyed, but not a great deal. Oops, I'm going to run out of time here. I'll finish with amphibians on the next screencast.